Hey, good morning, Harvester Christian Church, Troy campus. It is great to be with you this morning. Great to be here. If you've got your Bibles open to 1 Kings chapter 3, flip over to that or on the church app, however you want to do that. All right, so let's get something out of the way as we start off here, right? Most important thing we need to think about today is this, is that you came to church today and now we're going to be talking about leadership, and probably you're thinking to yourself, this has nothing to do with me. Because I'm not a leader. I don't lead and I don't have a position or a title or something like that. And, I don't own a corporation or whatever it is. So I don't have to listen. I'm going to look like I'm taking notes, but I'm really going to be on Instagram, right? So let's do this. Let's get this out of the way. Let's make a deal, right? If you give me about 3 or 4 minutes to convince you that you need to listen to a sermon on leadership, then you have to listen to the whole sermon. All right? Want to make that deal with me? Right. You agreed. All right. So here we go. Let's think about this for a second. So when we think about leadership, generally speaking, we think of leadership in one specific way. That is what we would call positional leadership. So a positional leader is someone that has, as it sounds, a position, right? A rank or a title or an office or something that gives them authority over other people. That's how we usually think of leadership. Now, those types of leaders are very important, and if that is you, whether you are a leader in the church or somewhere else, honestly, then this sermon is for you. There's another kind of leadership that is equally as important, and it's what we call positional leadership. And positional leadership draws its power not from we call it personal leadership. I'm confusing you. We've got positional leadership and personal leadership. Personal leadership draws its power not from a position, but from the person that wields it, right? Personal leadership is what we would just call influence. John Maxwell, who's a leadership guru, he defines leadership as influence. And so when we think about leadership from a personal perspective, it is the influence that you, as a person, have over other people. And while leadership is usually more than just influence, it's always at least just influence, right? So we talk about positional and personal leadership. That's what we're going to be hitting on today. Now, so as one way to finally cement the fact that you need to listen to the sermon, right? I've developed what I would just call a leadership test, all right? And this is highly scientific. It's very quick, but at the end of this, you will know whether or not you should listen to this sermon. You'll know if you're a leader, all right? So here's only 2 questions. First question, are you a person, all right? If you can answer yes to that, which I'm going to guess there's no, cyborgs or anything else in here today, right? Yes, you can say yes to that. Question number 2, do you know another person that you can influence, right? Do you know someone else in your life that you can influence? I'm going to say that the answer is yes. You know someone else. You're not isolated on a desert island or anything like that. So the answer to the question is, are you a leader, is yes, you are a leader. You are either a positional leader or a personal leader, right? You are a leader. So therefore, according to our deal, you have to listen to the whole sermon, right? So there we go. Now, seriously, if you are a student, or you're a parent, or a friend, or a grandparent, or a neighbor, or a boss, or an assistant, or a teacher, anything like, you are a leader in some way, shape, or form, either positional or personal. Right now, in all of my years of leading, whether like researching leading, or talking about it, or writing about it, whatever that is, one of the things that I've learned about leadership is that leadership is never as easy as it looks. We tend to judge leaders and go, well, that's easy, right? You should be able to do that. Just like when you watch HGTV, right? You can remodel your whole home in half an hour, right? It's really just, all you got to do is that. But leadership looks like that, but it's never it is. So let me give you a couple of things to think about from leadership, right? We tend to judge leaders on leadership being simple. Here's one way to look at it. We look at it and we go, well, leadership is A plus B equals C. In other words, if you just do this, and then you just do this, then this is what you get every time, right? Leadership is that easy. From the outside, that's what it looks like. Now, when you're the leader, this is what leadership tends to look like. It kind of looks like this, of like, I don't know what's going on here. I don't know. Look at all this mess of stuff that I have to deal with as a leader. That's what it looks like, and honestly, that's what it feels like as a leader too. Another way to look at it is this, is that we tend to think like leadership is just moving people from point A to point B, right? It's just taking people from here to there. You know, it's just, it's real easy. You just get your people to do this. It's like just being a mom, right? Getting a toddler ready for church. You're just moving from point A to point B, from home to church. It's really that simple, right? That's what it looks like from the outside. This is what leadership really is like, right? It is, we're going from point A to point B, but man, there's a lot of twists and a lot of turns and a lot of craziness in between those 2 points. That's what leadership really looks like. And that's the question that we really sort of come at today, is this, is that the truth is leadership never happens in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is that leadership happens in real life. And it deals with real people who have real struggles, who live in real situations that are really messed up most of the time. There are really high stakes for getting leadership wrong. And so that's the question, is how do we lead effectively in situations that just honestly are really messed up most of the time? Then situations that are just not simple, but they're incredibly complicated and messy and just sort of crazy. Well, when we think about leadership, I always go back from a biblical perspective and think about my favorite Old Testament character, who is Solomon. And Solomon was the original Old Testament wise guy, right? He's the OG when it comes to that. This is what we know about Solomon. Here's what the Bible tells us about him. Solomon was David's son. He was king. And it says, and God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and the breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and the people of the wisdom of Egypt. And the people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of this. I mean, that's a smart guy, right? And so when we think about it, he also wrote the book of Proverbs. Just simply says this. The first verse of Proverbs says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. So when we want to figure out how to be a wise leader, Solomon is the guy we want to turn to. Now, so here's what happened. David was this great king. He dies. His son now is the king. And God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, Solomon, what is it that you need to be a wise leader for my people? And God said, whatever you ask, this is what I will give you, right? That's like God gave him a blank check. That's pretty amazing. And so this is what Solomon actually asked for in chapter 3, verse 9. It says, this is what Solomon said, give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who's able to govern this great people? So God tells Solomon, whatever you need, I'll give to you. And Solomon says, give me wisdom. Give me a wise and understanding mind. And then, of course, God gave that to him. So let's learn some leadership lessons from Solomon today about how to lead in the messiness of life, right? He's going to give us just 3 steps. Here's the first step to leading in craziness, right? The messiness of life. It's this, is that in the dilemmas of leadership, seek God's justice. In the dilemmas of leadership, seek God's justice. So Solomon's first day on the job, this is what happens, right? We're going to read from 1 Kings chapter 3. I'm going to start reading in verse 16. It says, then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day, after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. And we were alone, and there was no one else in the house, only us 2 were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born. But the other woman said, no, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, no, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. And thus they spoke before the king. I mean, you think about like your first day on the job, right? And this is what comes at Solomon. Now, in those days, the king had a lot of different responsibilities. One of those responsibilities was being the final judge and arbiter of justice in the land. There were other judges, there were other courts in the land, but when a case was so important or so difficult, eventually it sort of came before the king. Now, let's think about this situation specifically. We notice right off the bat it says that there were these two prostitutes there. Now, when we think about this, one of the things we have to know is that in ancient Israel, one of the ways that not the Israelites, but the people outside of Israel worshipped is that they engaged in ritual prostitution at the temple. That's just what you did, right? It's one of the ways that they worshipped. It's also one of the reasons why God said you need to stay away from them, right? Is because they're going to do this horrible stuff. But here are these two ladies that become pregnant, most likely through this ritual prostitution. That's what happens. And they come before the king. Now notice, how many times in that story did they say, we're alone? Right? Just like, I live in this house with this other woman, and we were alone, and I gave birth. And she was alone, and she gave birth, and we're the only ones there. So here are these two women that through their role in this temple worship come into this situation. And they are alone. The fathers have abandoned them, if they even know who the fathers are. They're by themselves. They have to give birth by themselves. They're just in this horrible situation. And in the social economy of Israel, these two women were at the lowest of the low on the social scale. Right? These weren't two land barons coming before the king arguing over, how do we split up all this money? These are two women who are at the lowest end of society. And they're in this horrible, horrible situation. One of their sons has died, and now one of the women is trying to kidnap or steal the other son. And this case reaches the king because no one else could figure it out. No one else was wise enough to know how to make a good judgment on this. Now put yourself in the situation of these two women. Right? Use your imagination, right? Think of the horrible situation they work at this temple, right? And now they've got these sons. There's no fathers involved. They're abandoned. They're left to themselves. Well, one of them has died, and now one of them is trying to steal the other one. Imagine having that story told in public before the king. Imagine having to stand up and recite all of this, how difficult this was. And this is the situation that Solomon finds himself. I mean, this is a dilemma, right? How do we know which one of these women is telling the truth? Well, let's see what Solomon writes about this situation, right? It says this, to do righteousness and judgment and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Here's another one. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it completely. Another one from Proverbs. A righteous man knows the rights of the poor, and a wicked man does not understand such knowledge. And one more. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Proverbs teaches us that the primary job of a leader is to act justly, is to act in the way that God would have us to do it, especially those in positional leadership. That's the job of a leader. And it tells us that that's what we need to do. Now, we need to define, so it talks about up here about justice, right? We said in the dilemmas of leadership, look for God's justice. But we need to define what justice really means. Because there's a social definition of justice that we use. There's a cultural definition. There's a legal definition. But we want to know biblically, what does justice really mean? Here's a good definition of it from author Adam Gustine. It says, justice refers to the presence of God's shalom. That is God's wholeness, where, as some say, nothing is missing and nothing is broken. This comprehensive reality involves every arena of life and is the notion that Jesus is referring to when he said he came to bring life abundantly. Jesus said, I come to bring not just life, but life abundantly. So this idea that we see here is the idea of God's shalom. Now, you've probably heard that word before. right? Shalom is the Hebrew word. It's what the Israelites typically used when they greeted one another. We say, hey, what's going on? Hello. They would say shalom to one another. And the word literally means peace, but not like, hey, peace out, right? It is peace in the sense of, I wish you peace. I wish you God's peace in your life. So when we think about shalom, what shalom really says is, I wish that your situation was complete and lacking nothing. And that's the idea that when we talk about God's justice, that God's justice is God's presence in a situation where nothing is broken and nothing is missing, nothing is lacking. Right? So when we say that it's the job of the king to act justly, it's to act in a way that brings God's shalom into a broken situation, into a situation where God's presence is needed in order to bring healing and completeness to that. Now, here's the deal, is that a lot of times we look at a situation that needs God's justice outside of ourselves, right? That you need God's healing, I don't necessarily. But the reality is this, is that all of us have two almost competing realities in our life. One is that each of us is, according to Scripture, created in the image of God. It comes from Genesis chapter 1. It says God created humans in his image. And that image is what gives us value, right? Every human is created in the image of God, and because of that, every human is infinitely valuable. That's what gives us our worth and our identity, is that image of God. At the same time, each one of us has this image, but that image is broken or marred or incomplete because of sin in our life or because of just sin in general, right? So at once, we are valuable to God. At the same time, we have this image that is distorted. This image is just incomplete in our lives. That's why our lives are messy and crazy and just messed up a lot of times, because that image of God that we have is distorted or marred in that. Now, I want you to think for a second about a situation that perhaps you are connected to. It might be you as a positional leader, it might be some people that you lead or influence. It most likely is going to be you as a personal leader, someone that you know that is within your circle of influence. It might be here at church, it might be your neighborhood, it might be your family, it might be your place of work. Who knows? It might be your school, whatever that is, your friend, family. But think about a situation that is in need of God's shalom. And I'm going to challenge you right now to write that down. Like, write it down, take your phone out, write a note, like, do something, write it down on a piece of paper, and just write a few words that describe that situation, right? And just go, man, this is the situation that needs God's presence in it, that it needs God's justice. And I want you to hold on to that, because we're going to come back to it in a little bit. But let's go back to Solomon's dilemma, right? Here's Solomon, his first day on the job, and he has this case before him that is just incredibly difficult. He's got these two women, and the situation is so broken. There's a dead child. There's a child that's trying to be kidnapped. There's these two women who have been abandoned. They live in this horrible lifestyle, and their situation needs God's presence. And Solomon's call is to bring justice, to bring God's shalom to that presence. That's the first step. In the dilemmas of leadership, look for God's justice. But here's the second step. In the drama of leadership, seek God's wisdom. In the drama of leadership, seek God's wisdom. Now, let's continue this story with Solomon, starting in verse 23. It says, Then the king said, this one says, this is my son that is alive, and yours is dead. The other one says, no, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, listen to this. The king said, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. And the king said, divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, oh, my lord, give her the child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king answered and said, give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death, because she is the mother. When you talk about drama in a situation, right? So think about it. Use your imagination to picture this scene. Here's this ancient sort of the palace, right? And here's all these people that have come before the king. And everyone comes and has a case to hear before the king. And the king is sitting on his throne, right? And here's these two women who have just told the most horrific story. And they're arguing and they're fighting. And one woman is trying to steal the other one's baby because she's in such grief. And it's just this drama-filled situation. And the king finally, just imagine, the king rises from his throne. And remember, whatever the king says, that's the word, right? And the king rises as if he's going to give his pronouncement. And hush falls over the crowd, right? They want to know, what is he going to decide? And the king says the most absurd, ridiculous thing you can imagine. The king says, bring me a sword. Now think about that. Of all the things that people were expecting him to say, that was not one of them, right? And I'm sure the king says, bring me a sword, and the people were like, what? I think I misheard that. Did he say, bring me a sword? And the king says, I'm going to cut this child in two and give half to each mother. And the people were like, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. This is just absurd. And I mean, I use that word not in a funny way, but like, it's absurd. It's ridiculous. He's going to cut the child in two? And it's not just Solomon says, hey, I'm just kidding, right? They bring him the sword. And you can imagine Solomon saying, lay this child right here, and he raises the sword. Like, this is going to happen. Imagine the drama. These people are like, are we really going to witness this? And as he brings the sword up, the real mother says, no. Don't kill the child. I would rather give her the child than have him die. And Solomon lowers the sword and immediately knows that's the real mother. Wow. Imagine the drama of watching that actually happen. What a wise, wise king. Here's what Solomon says about wisdom. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. A lot of translations use the word wisdom there. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Here's another one. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding. For the gain from her, the her right there is referring to wisdom, right? He personifies wisdom as a female, probably not accidental, right? For the gain from her is better than gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. So Solomon says wisdom is the most valuable thing that you can possess. It's more valuable than money. It's more valuable than treasure. It is the most valuable thing you can possess. Like justice, though, let's define what wisdom really is, right? Well, a lot of times we have this picture of like an Eastern mystic sitting on a hill, a mountainside in Tibet, sort of chanting, and we think that's what wisdom is. But that's not what biblical wisdom is. Here's a great definition of it, is that wisdom is putting God's knowledge to work in everyday life. That's what wisdom is taking God's knowledge and saying, this is how this works in my life today. When I think of wisdom, I think back to one of the men I had the privilege of serving under, Ben Merrill. Many of you know Ben or knew him and know the name. Ben was the lead pastor of Harvester Christian Church for many years and just a larger-than-life figure in our church movement. Ben passed away this past year, but I was deeply affected by him serving on his staff. And so he's the personification of a wise leader for me. And so I just have 5 little lessons about leadership that I learned from Ben. And these just demonstrate how wisdom gets put into everyday life. I'm going to just give you these. These are leadership lessons from Ben Merrill. Number 5, the key to dealing with church problems is to outgrow them. So many times I heard Ben say, you know what, we've got this problem, or we would go, Ben, there's this problem, I don't know, and he's like, you know how we're going to deal with that? We're just going to outgrow it. We're just going to grow beyond this being a problem. And we did that a lot of times. Number 4, leaders are never too big to apologize. One of the great lessons I learned from Ben was early on when I started serving on it with him, is that we were in a staff meeting. We had staff meetings every Wednesday. And this is when we just had a pretty small staff, actually. And Ben kind of got out of sort in a meeting. Now, out of sort was like he was just a little aggravated and frustrated. But he rarely showed that. We didn't think anything about it. But after the meeting, we always went to lunch together. And Ben was like, no, I'm not going to lunch. You guys go. And he actually, I think he paid for us all to go to lunch. And he stayed behind. When we got back, every one of us had a handwritten note of apology on our desk from Ben, saying, I'm really sorry I got out of sorts in the meeting. That was not a big deal. But I learned such an important lesson that day, just you're never too big to apologize as a leader. Number 3, the way to handle money is a window, the way you handle money is a window into your spiritual life. So be generous to a fault. Think about that. The way you handle your money is really an insight into your spiritual life. Number 2, leaders never stop learning. Ben was in his 90s and he was still going to conferences and still reading books. Love that. And then probably the most important, the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap, right? Which is really true. So many times we make such horrible decisions when we are tired, right? And Ben said that a lot of times, like, you just need to go take a nap. Sometimes that's what you need to do. So how did Ben get so wise? Well, in the drama of leadership, he sought out God's wisdom and prayed for God to give him that wisdom. Now, think back to that situation I asked you to come up with a few minutes ago. I want you to think back to that situation. What is some of God's wisdom that needs to be spoken into that situation? What does God have to say about that situation that can bring shalom to it, that can bring justice to it, that can speak wisdom into that situation? And how are you going to get that wisdom? Well, read your Bible. Find God's wisdom in the pages of what he gave us and pray and ask God to give it to you. All right, so here's the third lesson from Solomon. It's just simply this. In the decisions of leadership, seek God's glory. When you have decisions to make in leadership, seek God's glory. Here's the final verse of this whole scene. It just says, all of Israel heard of the judgment that the king rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him. Why? To do justice. The wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So Solomon's verdict is divine wisdom. All of Israel hears about it, and not just Israel, but all the kings throughout the rest of the world. And not just Israel, but everyone is in awe of Solomon because he has the wisdom of God, not to just be wise, but to actually lead as a just king. Now, in short, God was glorified in Solomon's wisdom. He was glorified in God was glorified in Solomon's wisdom and leadership. And this is what Solomon says about seeking your own glory from Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. I love that it says, acknowledge him. Don't acknowledge yourself, but acknowledge him in all that you do. And then Proverbs, one more, right? Or be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. And we've got one more. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It's better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoils with the proud. Wow, that's so true. And I have to say, true confession time, it's really hard for leaders to not let pride go to their head. I say that as a leader. It's really hard to not believe when they say, oh, you did a great job, that's awesome. It's hard not to let that kind of fill you up and get sort of puffed up with pride. It's really easy to dismiss it when people chastise you or say, you didn't really do a great job. It's easy to dismiss that. But pride is one of the most difficult things for leaders to deal with. It's difficult to give God the glory when it seems like we're doing all the work ourselves. It just goes with the territory. And I've noticed that there's a trend lately, over the past couple years, There's a trend of Christians, actually, sort of watching churches and leaders self-destruct. There's always have been. We just know more about it now through social media or through documentaries or things like that or podcasts. That a lot of times we listen to these churches that just sort of crash and burn. These leaders that have these big ministries and they screw up, they do something wrong, and then everything crumbles around them. Or this church does something and it's a horrible thing that happens and the church just crumbles. And I've talked to so many Christians who are listening to this and sort of devouring this of sort of like this is like watching a car crash happen. Like it's like we can't turn our eyes away from it. And a lot of people are looking at failed ministries and failed leaders. They're going, well, then that's not for me. The church isn't for me. I don't want to trust any leader at all. Let me tell you something. The cure for bad leadership is not no leadership. The cure for bad leadership is godly leadership. The cure for a bad church, an ungodly church, is not to just simply walk away from church. The cure for it is to be in a godly church. And the only way that godly leaders will be godly is if people hold them accountable and help them and give them wisdom, right? And do that. So if you see bad leadership, if you see things bad in a church, the solution isn't to walk away from that. The solution is, you know what? How can we work together to bring God glory in this situation? So here's the question I have for you. What are you going to do about that situation that you wrote down? You've got it in your mind, right? It's in your family, it's in your school, it's in your work. I don't know where it is. But a lot of times we pray this prayer, God, this situation needs your presence in it. True. God, you need to send someone to bring them truth. You need to send someone to bring shalom and justice into that situation. And I think God probably goes, they're your friend. It's your family. It's your job. It's your church. Why do I need to send someone else? How about I send you? You already know the situation. You already know these people. Why don't you be part of the situation? Why don't you be the person that is my representative there and bring my peace and my wholeness and my completeness into that situation? I think that's the prayer. Is not, God, can you work in this situation? The prayer is, God, how can you use me to work in this situation? So here's my challenge. Go and lead in that situation. Be a person of influence. Be a positional leader that works and acts justly. Go and lead and seek God's wisdom in that drama. And go and give God the glory for what he can do in your situation. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the example of Solomon and how he brings us just such simple yet profound wisdom. Father, I know that we all have situations that are crazy. We have situations that are difficult, that are messed up all around us. And yet, Lord, you've called us to bring your peace and your completeness and your shalom into those situations. So, Father, right now, I pray for every person in this room. You would make us all bold. You would make us sensitive. You would make us caring in all of these scenarios. Father, give us the wisdom we need. And yet, Father, give us the peace that we can give to that situation. And I pray you will be glorified in all that we do. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.